no secret Canadian snowbirds haven't been flocking to South Florida lately. President Trump's immigration rules and tariffs have caused controversy in Canada.
More than 2,000 employees have been told over the past 3 days their jobs may be cut as part of the government's plan to get rid of 28,000 jobs over the next 4 years.
Numbers like these usually follow hurricanes or financial crashes. In Florida, they arrived without warning. 280,000 jobs disappeared. More than $52 billion drained out of the state economy. A winter tourism system that once powered entire regions unraveled in less than 2 years. There was no storm, no pandemic, no border closure. The trigger was political. A trade war fractured trust between the United States and Canada, and millions of ordinary travelers responded in the only way they could. They stopped coming. Tourism became leverage. Trust became the casualty. This collapse did not begin on Florida's beaches. It began in living rooms, retirement forums, airline booking screens, and quiet conversations among Canadian households. No sanctions were announced, no bans were issued. People simply changed their behavior. Flights were canceled, seasonal rentals were abandoned, long-standing routines were broken. The shock did not hit factories or ports first. It hit waiters, cleaners, airport staff, health workers, and small towns built entirely around winter visitors. Even now, many officials still describe the damage as temporary. The data says otherwise. This was not a dip. It was a withdrawal. In the year following the sharp escalation of trade tensions between the United States and Canada, Florida absorbed an economic shock few analysts believe possible in a mature tourism economy. The numbers did not trickle in gradually. They landed all at once. Airline capacity data, tourism tracking, and labor estimates all pointed to the same conclusion. Canadian travel did not slow. It vanished. For decades, Canadian visitors had injected between $38 and $42 billion a year into Florida's economy. That money sustained hotels, restaurants, real estate, transportation, healthcare services, and seasonal labor across the state. Within a single winter season, more than half of that spending disappeared. In snowbird-dependent counties, peak winter occupancy dropped by more than 40% compared to historical norms. Coastal municipalities that had spent years insulating themselves from volatility recorded vacancy rates not seen since the financial crisis. Discounts, incentives, and tax breaks failed to reverse the trend. Demand was not waiting. It had moved on. The labor impact followed immediately. Roughly 280,000 tourism-linked jobs were lost across Florida. When indirect losses are included, internal labor models suggest the true figure exceeded 310,000. These were not temporary layoffs. They were permanent exits. Families relocated, workers retrained, entire communities hollowed out. The breaking point was not a single announcement. It was a convergence. Tariff threats against Canadian aluminum, lumber, and agriculture collided with rhetoric portraying Canada as economically subordinate. That message traveled fast. Canadian media amplified it. Retirement associations debated it. Consumer groups responded. Behavior shifted before any formal retaliation occurred. Border anxiety accelerated the collapse. Stories of heightened screenings, entry denials, and enforcement activity circulated rapidly across Canadian news and social media. Whether those incidents were statistically rare did not matter. For retirees managing healthcare, property, and fixed incomes, unpredictability was unacceptable. Travel that once felt routine began to feel risky. Airline data confirmed this was not a delay. Canadian carriers cut winter capacity to Florida by double digits and redeployed planes to Europe, Mexico, the Caribbean, and Asia-Pacific routes. Those routes filled quickly. Florida routes did not. Florida officials initially leaned on familiar explanations: inflation, media exaggeration, temporary uncertainty. Local budgets told a harsher story. Tourist tax revenues collapsed by as much as 50% in some jurisdictions. Infrastructure projects stalled, school districts cut programs, emergency reserves drained. This was no longer a narrative problem. It was structural damage. What unsettled policymakers further was what happened next. Canadian data showed the behavior was not emotional or impulsive. It was calculated. The money did not disappear. It moved. Between $27 and $30 billion a year that once flowed into Florida was redirected elsewhere within 18 months. Canadian provinces absorbed the first wave. Winter occupancy climbed across Ontario, Quebec, British Columbia, and Atlantic Canada. Retirement housing expanded. Healthcare utilization stabilized. Service sector employment rose. Provincial tourism tax revenue surged. Money that once circulated through Florida now multiplied inside Canada. International redirection followed. Canadian airlines reduced Florida seat capacity by more than 30% while expanding routes to Europe, Mexico, and the Caribbean. Load factors on non-U.S. routes hit record highs. Florida flights struggled even with heavy discounts. Financial markets reacted quietly but decisively. Canadian banks and pension funds reduced exposure to U.S. tourism-dependent real estate and increased investment in domestic hospitality and politically neutral markets. In several Florida counties, Canadian-owned property listings surged more than 70% as owners chose liquidation over return. Prices softened, tax bases eroded, revenue forecasts were cut for years ahead. For Florida workers, the consequences were immediate. Service wages stagnated, clinics closed, residents left the state. A tourism shock became a labor crisis, then a demographic one. Surveys across Canada show most former snowbirds no longer view U.S. travel as predictable or neutral. Even those citing affordability or climate expressed hesitation rooted in trust, not cost. Once households reorganize healthcare, housing, and social networks, reversal becomes unlikely. A relationship built over generations unraveled in months. Washington failed to anticipate this outcome because it focused on tariffs, factories, and exports while overlooking services, confidence, and allied behavior. Tourism was assumed to be resilient and apolitical. That assumption collapsed. Canadian travel functioned as soft capital. It stabilized labor markets, supported municipal budgets, and inflated real estate values. When it withdrew, no federal mechanism replaced it. No stimulus restores goodwill. No policy reverses millions of individual decisions not to cross a border. A feedback loop formed. As Canadians disappeared, services declined. As services declined, experiences worsened. Spending dropped further. Businesses closed. This self-reinforcing spiral exposed the danger of dependence on a single foreign demographic. International observers noticed if Canada could disengage quietly and effectively, others could too. Consumption, tourism, and investment had become instruments of alignment. Canada's response required no announcements. Behavior changed. Domestic tourism expanded. Capital stayed home. What Florida experienced as collapse, Canada experienced as consolidation. The United States did not lose market share to competitors. It lost it to absence. Absence offers nothing to negotiate with. One internal planning metric now guides Florida's future assumptions. Even under optimistic scenarios, no more than 30% of former Canadian winter spending is expected to return over the next decade. That implies a permanent loss of $35 to $40 billion annually. The scale mirrors the decline of a major industrial sector, except this collapse came from political miscalculation, not technology or global competition. Florida's growth model magnified the damage. Municipal budgets expanded on the assumption of endless tourist revenue. Real estate values rose on expectations of foreign buyers. Labor markets adjusted to seasonal abundance. When Canadian money left, no alternative engine replaced it. Property taxes rose. Schools fell short. Infrastructure decayed. Workers left. Decline fed decline. Former snowbirds rebuilt their lives elsewhere. Advertising cannot reverse that. Incentives cannot erase perception. Tourism to the United States no longer holds the same meaning. One final data point confirms the permanence. Planning models across multiple Florida regions now assume a long-term annual loss of more than 160,000 seasonal residents tied almost entirely to Canadian withdrawal. These projections extend 15 years forward. Housing demand fell. Healthcare expansion was shelved. Transit plans were cut. These decisions were not ideological. They were mathematical. Florida did not lose its winter economy because Canadians were angry. It lost it because Canadians recalculated risk and decided the United States no longer met their tolerance. The trade conflict was meant to assert leverage. Instead, it exposed how much of the American economy depends on invisible relationships that can disappear without warning.